Walk yourself. That's what happens when you marry a nobody. Dad laughed and sat down in the back row with Mom to watch me do it. I gripped my bouquet and started down the aisle alone. Halfway, the doors behind me swung open. 30 strangers in matching gray walked in and lined both sides of the aisle. One of them stopped, looked straight at my dad, and said, "Sir, to explain how we got to that moment, I have to go back almost a year, because if I just told you my father refused to walk me down the aisle, you'd think it came out of nowhere. It didn't. It had been building since the first Thanksgiving I brought my fiancé home. And looking back, I can trace almost every domino that fell between that dinner and the one my father knocked over in the dressing room an hour before my wedding. My father built his business from a single delivery truck into a mid-sized freight brokerage that by the time I got engaged, moved contracts for a dozen regional retailers. He was proud of it in a way that had curdled into something closer to contempt for anyone who hadn't built something of their own. He talked about self-made men, like it was a club with strict membership requirements, and he judged everyone who walked through our door against that measuring stick, including, eventually, the man I loved. My fiancé didn't fit the club. He managed the overnight shift at a regional distribution warehouse, on his feet for 10 hours at a stretch. He was good at it in ways that weren't visible from the outside. He'd taken a chaotic, understaffed shift and turned it into the most reliable crew in the building, trained half the new hires himself, caught safety problems before they became incidents. None of that translated into anything my father could respect, because none of it looked like ownership. It looked to him like someone else's employee. The first time I brought him to dinner, my father didn't stand up to shake his hand, just nodded at him from his seat at the head of the table like he was evaluating a delivery that hadn't been properly labeled. My fiancé, gracious as always, extended his hand anyway and said it was nice to finally meet him. My father shook it eventually, limply, the kind of handshake that communicates exactly what it's supposed to communicate. It only got worse from there. At the next family gathering, a 4th of July barbecue with aunts and uncles and cousins circling the yard, my father asked, loudly enough for half the yard to hear, whether my fiancé had any actual plans or whether driving a forklift was going to be the whole story. My fiancé answered calmly, explaining that he was being considered for a shift supervisor promotion, that he'd managed a team of 11 for 2 years, that the warehouse had cut its incident rate nearly in half since he took over nights. My father listened with the blankness of a man who'd already decided the answer didn't matter, then changed the subject to a new contract his brokerage had just landed, a 3-year regional warehousing and fulfillment deal, the biggest in the company's history, one he wouldn't stop talking about all summer. I remember it mostly for how he framed it. Real business, he called it, unlike pushing boxes around for somebody else's company. I didn't think much of the phrase then. I would think about it a great deal later. My mother's disapproval was quieter, but no less pointed. She asked my fiancé once, in a tone dressed up as concern, whether he ever worried about providing, as though the question wasn't really a question at all. He told her evenly that he'd been the sole provider for his 2 younger siblings since he was 19, after their parents died in a car accident, and that he understood exactly what providing required. My mother didn't have a response to that. She just smiled, the thin smile she used when she wanted a conversation to be over. I used to leave those dinners and cry in the car before I'd even gotten the key in the ignition, furious on his behalf, humiliated on my own. He'd reach over and take my hand and tell me every time that it didn't matter what my parents thought of him, only what I thought, and that he wasn't going anywhere regardless of how many barbecues he had to sit through. I believed him. I still believe that part. What I didn't understand yet was how much further my father was willing to take his disapproval once an actual wedding date was on the calendar, and there was no more pretending this was a phase I might grow out of. The engagement dinner was where it really turned. We announced it over dessert, my fiancé's hand steady around mine while he asked my father, out of respect for tradition, if he'd support the marriage. My father set his fork down very deliberately and said, "I hope you know what you're taking on. Marrying into a family that's used to a certain standard. Not congratulations. Not even a grudging acceptance. Just a warning, delivered like a business term he expected us to accept without negotiation." My fiancé said only that he understood, and that he intended to build his own standard, on his own terms, with me beside him. My father made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and picked his fork back up. Planning the wedding meant planning around my father the way you plan around weather. There were venues he vetoed for reasons that had nothing to do with the venues. There was a guest list argument over whether my fiancé's coworkers, people he considered close friends, people who'd shown up for him in ways my own extended family never had, belonged on the invitation list at all. "It's not that kind of wedding," my father said, and I understood exactly what he meant by kind, and I invited them anyway, and he sulked through an entire Sunday dinner about it. 2 nights before the wedding, I was up late finishing seating charts when I heard my father on the phone in his study, door not quite closed. "She's marrying a forklift driver," he said to whoever was on the other end, my uncle I'd learn later, tone somewhere between disbelief and apology, like the marriage was an embarrassment he had to explain away to people who mattered. "I don't know what she sees. I really don't." I stood in the hallway for a long moment, seating binder still in my hands, and decided I would not let this be the thing that ruined my wedding. I told myself he'd come around by the ceremony itself. I was wrong, but I wouldn't find out how wrong until the morning. The morning of the wedding, everything felt almost normal for the first few hours. My mother helped me into my dress. My bridesmaids filled the room with curling irons and champagne, and someone always looking for bobby pins. My father came by briefly around 9, kissed my cheek, told me I looked beautiful, and I let myself believe for about 40 minutes that the year of tension had resolved into something ordinary. I know now he'd already decided what he was going to do. He was just waiting waiting for the moment that would cost me the most and give him the least chance to be talked out of it. An hour before the ceremony, I was sitting at the vanity in the bridal suite while my youngest bridesmaid pinned the last piece of my veil into place. I remember the specific quality of light in that room, late morning coming through tall windows, everything gold and soft and exactly the way I pictured it for months. Then there was a knock, and my father let himself in without waiting for an answer, which should have told me something immediately because he'd knocked and waited for everything else all week. He asked everyone else to give us a minute. My bridesmaids filed out, glancing back with the uncertainty of people who sense something is wrong but don't have enough information to name it. The door clicked shut. My father stood near the window, hands in his pockets, and for a moment said nothing, just looked at me in my dress like he was reconsidering something for the last time and landing on the same answer. "Your grandfather isn't coming," he said finally. Golf thing came up. I told him that was fine, that I understood, that Grandpa's health made travel difficult anyway and we planned around it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that this was the whole conversation, that he'd come in to relay a minor scheduling update and would leave again. He didn't leave, and "I'm not walking you down that aisle," he said. "I'm not going to stand up in front of 200 people and pretend I'm proud of this." I asked him what he meant, even though I understood exactly what he meant, because some part of me needed him to say it plainly so I couldn't later convince myself I'd misheard it. "You know what I mean?" he said. "You're marrying a warehouse guy, a forklift operator. I've spent 30 years building something, and you're about to hitch yourself to somebody who'll never be more than what he already is." He said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse, delivered flat, like a fact rather than an opinion. "Dad, please," I said. "It's my wedding, today, right now. Walk yourself," he said. "That's what happens when you marry a nobody." Then he laughed. Not a bitter laugh, an actual one, short and genuine, like he'd landed a punchline he'd been sitting on for months and was pleased with the delivery. He turned and walked out, and a few minutes later, through the cracked door, I watched him settle into the very back pew beside my mother, arms crossed, chin lifted, the posture of a man arriving early for a show he intended to enjoy. I sat at that vanity for a long moment, not fully understanding what had just happened. My hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. My maid of honor came back in first, took one look at my face, and asked what he'd said. I told her, and I watched her expression shift from concern to something closer to fury, the kind of anger you feel on behalf of someone you love that's somehow sharper than anything you'd feel for yourself. The wedding coordinator appeared next, a woman named Renata who'd been steady through 8 months of planning, and even she looked uncertain now, glancing between me and the closed door like she was calculating how many minutes of buffer we had before 200 guests started to notice something was wrong. She asked, gently, if I wanted to postpone, if there was anyone else, an uncle, a family friend, who could step in. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to picture my fiancé standing at that altar right now, on the other side of those doors, waiting for me with no idea any of this was happening. I thought about how he'd spent a year absorbing every insult my father had thrown at him without once asking me to choose between them, without once suggesting we skip the family entirely and elope somewhere quiet where none of this would matter. He'd earned better than a ceremony that started with me falling apart in a dressing room because my father couldn't set aside his pride for 2 hours. "No," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I'll walk myself." Renata didn't argue. She just nodded, the way people do when they recognize a decision has already been made, and their job is to support it rather than question it. She asked if I needed a minute before we lined up. I told her I didn't, that I'd rather just do it now before I had time to think too hard about it. My bridesmaids reassembled around me, and I could see them trying to arrange their faces into something normal, something celebratory for my sake. My maid of honor squeezed my hand once, hard, and told me she was proud of me, which nearly undid the composure I'd spent the last 10 minutes building. I told her not yet, that I needed to save whatever I had left for the actual walk. We moved into position at the back of the chapel. Through the doors, I could hear the low murmur of 200 people settling into their seats, the string quartet finishing whatever piece they'd been asked to play as a prelude, the particular hush that falls over a room right before something is about to begin. I could hear, too, though I told myself I was imagining it, the specific silence of an empty space where a father's footsteps should have been, where his arm should have been looped through mine, where 30 years of assuming this moment would look a certain way collapsed into the reality that it wasn't going to. I gripped my bouquet so tightly I'd later find small bruises across my palm from where the stems had pressed into my skin. Renata gave the signal to the quartet. The doors began to open. The doors swung open onto a wall of 200 faces turning in unison, and for a moment I forgot how to move. The string quartet shifted into the processional, the notes I'd chosen months ago for a completely different version of this walk, one where my father's arm was steady under mine and none of this was happening. I made myself take the first step because Renata's hand pressed lightly against my back, a small, wordless push forward. I kept my eyes fixed on the altar, on my fiancé, refusing to let myself look toward the empty space at my side where my father should have been. I could feel it anyway. The specific shape of that absence, the way 200 people's attention seemed to catch on it half a beat after I appeared, a ripple of confusion moving backward through the pews as people registered that I was walking in alone and started glancing at each other at the back row, trying to piece together what they were seeing. My fiancé wasn't smiling. I noticed it almost immediately, the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes moved past me toward the doors and then back, like he was doing the same math everyone else was doing and arriving at an answer he didn't like. He'd clocked the empty space beside me before I'd even cleared the first row of pews. I watched something harden in his expression, not anger exactly, more like a man recalibrating in real time, deciding how he was going to get through the next several minutes words without letting what he was feeling show on his face for my sake. I could hear whispers behind me now, low and overlapping, the particular texture of a crowd trying to be discreet and failing. Someone near the front, an aunt on my mother's side, made a small sound of surprise. I kept walking. I'd promised myself I would get through this without stopping, without turning around, without giving my father the satisfaction of watching me falter in front of everyone he'd wanted to witness this. I was perhaps halfway down the aisle when I registered that the whispering behind me had changed in quality, sharpened into something more startled, and I heard, beneath the music, the unmistakable sound of the heavy chapel doors at the back swinging open again. My first thought, absurd and immediate, was that my father had changed his mind, that some flicker of shame had finally caught up to him in the 60 seconds since I'd started walking, and he was coming to take his place beside me even now, even too late to matter. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see over my shoulder. It wasn't my father. 30 men were filing through the doors, and the sight of them stopped whatever thought I'd been having entirely. They moved with a strange, deliberate coordination, not rushed, not chaotic, more like a unit that had done this before, though I couldn't imagine what this could possibly be. They were all dressed identically in matching charcoal gray suits, and as they entered, they split smoothly into two lines without any visible signal passing between them, moving down either side of the center aisle and taking up positions along the outer edge of the pews, standing shoulder to shoulder like some kind of honor guard that nobody had requested and nobody in the room could explain. The chapel went from a low murmur to something closer to total silence in the space of about 5 seconds. I stopped walking entirely, my bouquet gripped so hard my knuckles had gone white, watching this unfold with no idea what I was looking at or why it was happening at my wedding at this specific moment in front of every person I knew. My mother half rose from her seat in the back row, one hand pressed flat against her chest. I heard, faintly, my father's voice start to say something and then cut off mid-word, as though whatever he'd been about to say had simply evaporated when he understood what he was looking at. The men continued filing in until all 30 had found their positions, and then the doors closed behind them with a heavy final sound that seemed to punctuate the silence rather than break it. For a moment, nobody in that chapel moved at all. I stood frozen in the center of the aisle, halfway between the doors and the altar, halfway between the wedding I'd braced myself to survive, and something else entirely that I didn't yet have a name for. One of them stepped forward from the line. He was older than most of the others, silver-haired with the kind of unhurried bearing that suggested he was accustomed to rooms going quiet when he had something to say. He didn't look at me. He walked instead toward the back row toward my father and stopped directly beside his pew. He turned, looked straight at him. "Sir," he said, and even that single word carried enough weight, enough deliberate calm, that the entire chapel seemed to lean forward half an inch, waiting to hear whatever was going to come next. "With respect," the man said, "you don't get to sit there and enjoy this. Not after what you just said to your daughter." My father's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I watched him from my position in the aisle, too far away to see every detail of his face, but close enough to see him shrink slightly in his seat. Some of the certainty that had carried him through the dressing room conversation visibly draining out of him in real time. "Who are you?" my father finally managed, though it came out less like a demand and more like a genuine question from a man who'd lost his footing. "My name is Desmond," the silver-haired man said. "I don't imagine that means anything to you. It means something to your daughter's fiancé." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the altar, toward the man I was about to marry, who was standing very still, watching this unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. We work with him. Every single person standing in this aisle right now has worked under him at some point over the last several years, and when word got around this morning about what happened here, every one of us who could get away cleared our schedules and drove down. "Worked under him," my father repeated, and I could hear the confusion in it, the specific disorientation of a man trying to reconcile new information with a story he'd already decided was finished. 2 years ago, Desmond continued, his voice carrying easily now to every corner of the silent chapel, there was an electrical fire on the floor he manages. Started in the back corner near the loading dock, spread fast because of how much cardboard and packaging material was stored back there. Sprinkler system malfunctioned. We had people trapped on the mezzanine level with the main stairwell already filling with smoke. He paused, letting that settle before he went on. Your future son-in-law went back in, not once, 3 separate times, while the fire department was still 4 minutes out, found a man with a broken leg who couldn't get down the emergency stairs on his own, and carried him down 4 flights, over his shoulder, through smoke thick enough that our safety officer told us afterward he shouldn't have been able to see 6 inches in front of his own face. The chapel had gone so quiet I could hear the candles at the altar flickering, the small sound of wax and flame that would normally be inaudible under 200 people breathing and shifting in their seats. Nobody was shifting now. There's a plaque with his name on it in the break room at our facility, Desmond said. Company put it up themselves, no request from any of us, because what he did that day is the kind of thing that doesn't happen very often, and everyone who was there wanted it remembered. I don't know what you call a man like that where you come from, sir. Where I come from, we call him someone you'd trust with your life, not a nobody you're too proud to walk your own daughter toward. I watched my father's face during all of this, watched the color drain out of it in stages, watched him open his mouth twice more and find nothing to say either time. My mother sat frozen beside him, one hand still pressed against her chest, staring at Desmond with an expression somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like relief, like she'd been given permission to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in months. We heard the bride was walking herself in this morning, Desmond said, quieter now, though his voice still carried in the stillness. We didn't think that was right, not for a man who spent years years showing up for every person on that floor, and not for the woman he's about to marry, who deserves better than walking into her own wedding alone because somebody in this room couldn't set aside his pride for 2 hours. He let the silence sit for another moment, long enough that I could hear someone near the front of the chapel start to cry quietly. One of my fiancé's co-workers, maybe. Someone who'd been there for the fire and was living through the memory of it again in real time. Then Desmond turned away from my father entirely, walked a short distance to where I still stood frozen in the center of the aisle, and offered me his arm. "Mrs." he started, then caught himself, smiled slightly. "Not yet, I suppose. May I have the honor?" I looked back once, past him, toward my father, who was still sitting exactly where he'd been, staring at his own hands like he didn't recognize them. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. Neither of them moved. Neither of them said anything at all. I took Desmond's arm. We finished the walk together, the two of us moving slowly down the center of an aisle lined on both sides by 30 men in matching gray suits, every one of them standing a little straighter as I passed, a few of them nodding, one older man near the back wiping his eyes openly and not seeming to care who saw. When we reached the altar, my fiancé was openly crying, his composure finally cracking after holding it together through everything that had just happened. Desmond placed my hand in his, said something quiet to him that I didn't catch, and then stepped back to rejoin the others along the aisle. For a moment, the entire chapel seemed to exhale at once. Then somebody near the front started clapping, tentative at first, and it spread through the pews like something catching fire, until the whole room was on its feet, applauding in a way that felt less like celebration for a wedding and more like relief that something had been set right. I thought, in that moment, that this was the whole story, that the worst of it had happened and passed, that my father's cruelty had been answered, and the day could now become what it was always supposed to be. I wouldn't understand until much later that afternoon how wrong I was about that, and how much further this particular story still had to go before it was finished. The ceremony itself passed in a kind of blur that I've only been able to reconstruct afterward from what people told me, from photos, from the video our photographer kept running the entire time without either of us remembering to ask her to stop. I remember the specific warmth of my fiancé's hands when he took mine at the altar. I remember Desmond and the other men taking seats that had somehow appeared for them at the ends of pews, folding chairs brought in from somewhere by ushers who seemed as confused as everyone else about the logistics of accommodating 30 unexpected guests. The officiant, a family friend who'd known me since childhood, handled the whole disruption with more grace than I would have managed in her position, pausing just long enough to let the room settle before continuing as though 30 men in matching suits appearing mid-ceremony was a completely ordinary occurrence. When she asked if anyone present objected to the marriage, the question that's usually a formality, a line nobody expects to matter, the silence that followed felt different than it would have an hour earlier. I glanced toward the back row without meaning to. My father kept his eyes down and said nothing at all. We exchanged the vows we'd written months earlier before any of this happened, before I could have imagined needing words that would carry this much weight. My fiancé's voice broke twice while he spoke his, and I understood exactly why. Understood that he wasn't just responding to the ceremony itself, but to everything that had happened in the 20 minutes before it. The specific experience of watching 30 people he'd quietly helped over the years show up for him in a moment he hadn't known he needed defending. When he slid the ring onto my finger, the whole chapel rose to its feet, and this time it wasn't the tentative, uncertain applause from earlier. It was full and immediate, everyone standing at once, and the 30 men along the aisle clapped loudest of anyone in the room, a few of them visibly emotional in a way that suggested this moment meant something specific and personal to each of them individually, not just as spectators to somebody else's happy ending. We walked back up the aisle as married people for the first time, past all those familiar faces and all those unfamiliar ones, and for a few minutes, walking out into the sunlight outside the chapel with my husband's hand tight around mine, I let myself believe the hardest part of the day was entirely behind us. The reception was held in a converted barn about 20 minutes from the chapel, string lights crisscrossing overhead, long tables set with the centerpieces I'd spent an embarrassing number of hours agonizing over months earlier. Guests filtered in slowly, still visibly processing what they'd witnessed, and I watched little clusters of conversation form around the room, people clearly retelling the chapel scene to each other in hushed, urgent tones, comparing notes on what they'd seen and heard. My father found me near the edge of the dance floor about an hour into the reception, after most of the initial shock had settled into something more like a low, persistent hum running under the whole event. He looked different than he had in the chapel, smaller somehow, like whatever had been holding him upright through the ceremony had partially given out once the immediate audience thinned. "I owe you an apology," he said, which were not words I'd heard from him more than a handful of times in my entire life. I didn't realize. Didn't realize what, exactly? I asked, and I wasn't trying to be cruel. I genuinely wanted to know which part of the last hour had actually changed his mind, whether it was the fire story specifically, or just the sheer number of witnesses to his own humiliation. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He mentioned the fire, said something about not knowing the full picture, and I listened to all of it while feeling something cooler and more distant than I expected to feel, something that recognized this apology for what it was, an apology extracted by circumstance rather than offered freely, the kind that comes only after a man has been publicly cornered by facts he can't argue with. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, "but I need you to understand something. Actions matter more than words to me right now. You have a long way to go before I trust that you mean any of this." He nodded, accepted that without arguing, which was itself unusual for him, and then he did something that surprised surprised me. He sought out my husband directly, found him near the bar getting drinks for my bridesmaids, and shook his hand. Really shook it this time. Not the limp, evaluating handshake from that first dinner over a year earlier. My husband, gracious as he always was, accepted it, thanked him for coming, and I watched the two of them exchange a few words I couldn't hear from across the room. I should have felt relieved watching that. Mostly I did, but there was something underneath the relief that I couldn't quite name yet. A small, persistent unease that I told myself was just leftover adrenaline from the morning, the natural aftershock of a day that had already asked more of me than any single day reasonably should. I didn't know yet that the unease was trying to tell me something real. The unease found its shape a few hours later, during the toasts, in a moment so small I almost missed its significance entirely. My uncle, the same uncle my father had called 2 nights before the wedding, the one who'd heard she's marrying a forklift driver, delivered like an apology, stood up with a champagne glass to give an impromptu toast, the kind that happens at every wedding once enough alcohol has been poured and someone decides they have something to say. He was warm about it, generous even, congratulating us both, making a joke about how he'd never seen my father change his mind about anything so quickly in his life. People laughed. I laughed too, mostly out of relief that the tension of the day seemed to be dissolving into something lighter. Then he said something that snagged in my memory and wouldn't let go. "Your dad's going to owe these gentlemen a favor," he said, gesturing loosely toward the table where Desmond and several of the others were seated, given how much of his new contract runs through their building anyway. I remember smiling automatically, the way you do at a toast, without fully processing the sentence. It was only later, replaying the day in my head while I lay awake that night, that I understood I'd heard something that didn't quite fit, a detail that pointed towards something larger than a coincidence of geography. I found my uncle near the dessert table about 20 minutes later and asked him what he'd meant. He looked slightly sheepish, the particular sheepishness of someone who'd said more than they meant to at a party, and was now being asked to account for it while sober people watched. "Oh, it's nothing, it's just your dad's new contract, the big warehousing deal he's been talking about all year. It routes through a regional distribution hub. I just assumed." He stopped himself, looked over toward Desmond's table again, and something shifted in his expression, like he was doing a piece of math for the first time in real time, the same math I would end up doing myself over the following hour. I found my husband a few minutes later, pulled him gently away from a conversation with my bridesmaids, and asked him a question I hadn't thought to ask all day, in all the chaos of everything else that had happened. "What's the name of the facility you manage?" I said. "The actual company name, not just the warehouse." He told me, and the name meant nothing to me on its own. But when I found Desmond a few minutes later, drink in hand, still glowing slightly from whatever had made the earlier part of the day meaningful to him personally, and asked him to confirm the name of the parent company that operated the facility, he told me without hesitation, clearly not understanding yet why I was asking. It was the same company, I realized, standing there with my heart starting to beat a little too fast for a conversation that was ostensibly about logistics, whose name I recognized from a completely different context. I'd seen it on paperwork in my father's home office more than once over the past year. Correspondence and contract drafts he'd left out on his desk during the exact period he'd been bragging about his new deal, the biggest of his brokerage's history, the one he'd used all summer as evidence of what real business looked like compared to pushing boxes around. My father's new 3-year contract, the deal he'd been so proud of, the deal he'd invoked specifically to diminish my husband's job in front of an entire backyard full of relatives. It ran directly through the facility my husband managed, not adjacent to it, not nearby, through it. My father's business, the thing he measured his own worth by, the thing he'd used as a cudgel against a man he considered beneath our family, depended in part on the operation my husband ran. I stood there for a long moment trying to figure out whether my father knew this, whether he'd known it the whole time and simply never made the connection between the warehouse manager his daughter was marrying and the facility handling his own company's fulfillment, or whether he genuinely had no idea, whether the two things had simply never touched in his mind because he'd never once bothered to ask my husband a real question about his work, never once shown enough curiosity to learn a detail that would have made the connection obvious months earlier. I decided I needed to find out, not to embarrass him further, though a part of me won't pretend that impulse wasn't there. I needed to understand what he'd actually been dismissing all along, because I was starting to suspect it was considerably more than a forklift. I found him near the edge of the barn, drink in hand, looking more relaxed than he had all day, the particular ease of a man who believes the worst of a difficult situation is safely behind him. I asked if I could speak with him for a minute, and something in my tone must have registered, because his ease flickered slightly before he agreed. "The contract," I said. "The big one. The one you've been talking about since July." "What about it?" he said, and I could hear the first note of wariness entering his voice. "Do you know which facility handles the fulfillment side? The actual building? Who runs it?" He didn't, of course. He'd never asked. He'd signed off on a deal worth several $1,000,000 to his business without once being curious about the operation on the other end of it, without once wondering who was responsible for making sure his contract actually got fulfilled correctly, on time, without the kind of errors that could have cost him the deal entirely. "It's my husband's warehouse," I said. "He's been running fulfillment for your contract since it started. 9 months, Dad. 9 months, and you never once asked him a single question about his actual job that wasn't designed to make him feel small." I watched the color drain out of his face for the second time that day, though this time it wasn't in a chapel full of witnesses. This time it was just the two of us, near the edge of a barn, string lights swaying slightly overhead in the evening breeze, and my father finally understanding, all at once, once exactly how much he'd been dismissing without ever bothering to look closely enough to see it. My father asked me to explain what I meant, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the version I'd been hearing all year. All that easy dismissiveness gone, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain. I told him I didn't have the full details, that this wasn't my story to tell, and I went and found my husband, who was standing near the dance floor with two of his coworkers, still riding the warmth of the day, still not fully aware of the conversation that had just happened near the edge of the barn. I asked him quietly to come speak with my father. He looked briefly confused, glanced toward where my father was standing, and something crossed his face that told me he already suspected what this was going to be about, or at least suspected it wasn't going to be pleasant. The three of us stood together near a quieter corner of the reception, away from the music, away from the crowd still dancing under the string lights. My father asked my husband directly, without any of his usual condescension, to explain the connection between the contract and the facility. My husband was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much to say, how much restraint to exercise in a moment that would have been easy to use for something closer to satisfaction. Then he told him, 4 months into the contract, he explained, his facility's intake system flagged a discrepancy in the shipment volumes coming through from my father's brokerage, numbers that didn't reconcile cleanly with the manifests being submitted upstream. Most managers, he said, would have let it pass to someone else's desk, would have assumed it was a clerical error that would sort itself out eventually. He hadn't. He pulled the documentation himself, cross-referenced 3 weeks of intake logs against the submitted manifests, and found that the discrepancy wasn't clerical at all. It was structural, a pattern of underreporting that, left unaddressed, would have triggered a compliance audit within the fiscal quarter, the kind of audit that regularly ended contracts of that size, the kind that could have unraveled the biggest deal of my father's career before it had even finished its first year. He hadn't gone to my father with it because he didn't work for my father, had no formal channel to raise the issue directly, and didn't yet know that the man whose contract was at risk was about to become his father-in-law. He'd gone through his own company's compliance office instead, quietly filed the discrepancy report through proper channels, and worked with his facility's operations team over the following 6 weeks to correct the reporting structure before it ever reached the threshold that would have triggered an audit. There was a paper trail, he said, an actual documented compliance correction, time-stamped, filed months before our wedding, sitting in his company's records exactly where anyone with the right access could find it. You fixed it, my father said slowly, like he was still catching up to what he was hearing. You found a problem that would have ended my contract, and you fixed it, without telling me, without telling anyone. It wasn't about you, my husband said gently but without apology. It was my job. Protecting the integrity of that intake process is what I'm responsible for, regardless of whose name is on the contract upstream. I didn't know it was your deal specifically until tonight, when your daughter asked me the question that made the connection obvious. But even if I had known, I'd have handled it exactly the same way. That's not a favor I did for you. That's just what doing my job correctly looks like. I watched my father absorb this in real time, watched something in his posture change, the particular collapse of a man realizing that the story he'd told himself all year, a story where his own hard-won success stood in contrast to a son-in-law who'd amount to nothing, had been quietly, invisibly inverted the entire time, that the nobody he'd dismissed at every family dinner had, in fact, already protected the thing my father valued most about himself, protected it before either of them knew the two of them were connected at all, protected it without asking for credit or even mentioning it because it had simply been the right thing to do. I could pull the records, my husband offered, quiet, not performing anything. If you want to see them, it's all documented, time-stamped filings, the correction log, everything. I'm not telling you this to make a point. You asked what happened, and I'm telling you the truth. My father didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the last of whatever certainty had carried him through the morning, through the dressing room, through 30 years of measuring people by a standard he'd never once applied to himself with any real scrutiny. I don't need to see the records, he said. I believe you. And then, quieter, almost to himself, I spent a year telling people you'd never be more than what you already were. And you'd already saved the thing I was proudest of before either of us knew we were standing in the same story. Nobody said anything for a moment. The music continued somewhere behind us, distant and unbothered, the ordinary sounds of a wedding reception carrying on exactly as it should, while 3 people stood at its edge absorbing something that had nothing to do with dancing or cake or any of the things a reception was supposed to be about. My father didn't say much else that night. He found my mother, said something quiet to her that I didn't hear, and the two of them left earlier than most of the other guests, before the cake was cut, before the last of the toasts. He hugged me at the door briefly, and it felt different than his hugs usually did, less certain of itself, like a man recalibrating a gesture he'd performed the same way for 30 years, and suddenly wasn't sure how to do anymore. I didn't see him again for almost 3 weeks after the wedding. When we finally spoke, it was a short phone call, him asking careful, specific questions about my husband's work that he'd never once thought to ask in the entire year we'd been together. What a typical shift actually involved, what the promotion he'd been up for required, whether the facility was hiring. I answered what I could and told him the rest was a conversation he needed to have directly, that I wasn't going to keep serving as the translator between 2 men who were fully capable of talking to each other, now that the excuse for not doing so had run out. He called my husband himself the following week. I don't know everything that was said because my husband, true to form, didn't come home wanting to relitigate it or turn it into a story about vindication. He mentioned only that my father had asked to see the compliance filing, the actual documentation, and that when he he pulled it up on his laptop and shown him the timestamp, 4 months before the wedding. My father had gone quiet for a long time, before finally asking if there was anything he could do to make up for the year he'd spent treating him like he was worth less than the paperwork on his own desk. My husband told him the same thing he told me months earlier, in a different context entirely, that actions mattered more than words, and that he wasn't interested in an apology performed for an audience, only in whether anything actually changed going forward. I think about that morning often, the dressing room, the laugh, the 200 faces turning to watch me walk in alone. I think about how certain my father was that day, how completely he believed his own version of what my husband was worth, built on nothing but a job title and a lifetime of measuring people by a single narrow standard he'd never once turned on himself. I think about how close that certainty came to being the last word on the day I got married. If 30 strangers in matching gray suits hadn't walked through those doors when they did, if I hadn't asked one more question at the reception that unraveled something my father had never bothered to look at closely enough to see, he'd spent a year calling my husband a nobody, the whole time without either of them knowing it, that nobody had already been quietly holding up the one thing my father was proudest of, asking for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement.